On the day the sky cracked open over Coldwater Station, Eli Merrill was 40 meters underground, with his arm buried to the shoulder in a front pump. And that was the only reason he lived long enough to matter. The moon they called Tethys 9 was a ball of black ice the size of a fist held against a window. No sun worth the name, just the gas giant overhead like a bruise that never healed, throwing down a light the color of old iron. Coldwater was a coolant refinery sunk into the crust, a knuckle of habitat and pipe and pump that drew slush from the deep and split it into water and fuel for ships that never landed and barely waved. 41 souls worked it on a good rotation. There had not been a good rotation in a long while. Eli had the grammar of cold the way some men have scripture. He knew the way a seal whistled before it failed, the particular silence a pump made in the half-second before it seized. His hands were a map of the lessons, knuckles split and healed and split again. 2 fingers on the left that no longer fully closed. He was humming when the alarm went. The same 6 notes he always hummed, a tune his mother used to sing over a stove in a place with weather. And he did not stop humming, even when the floor jumped under him and the dust came down from the conduits in a slow gray rain. He thought it was a quake. Tethys flexed sometimes, tidal, groaning in its orbit. And the second jolt came, and the third, evenly spaced, and Eli took his arm out of the pump because nothing natural keeps a rhythm like that. Up the access shaft, the lights stuttered and went amber. Somebody was screaming on the comm in a way that had no words in it. He found Sana at the lock to the surface gantry, and that was the picture he would carry afterward, the one that woke him for the rest of his life. Sana Okoro, with her helmet under one arm and her face turned up to the ceiling like she was watching weather. Except there was no weather, only the thing coming down through it. "Don't," he said, because he knew her, because she went toward things while everyone else went away from them. She had her hand on the lock cycle. Outside, beyond the gantry, a shape was lowering itself onto the ice without landing. Hanging there, on nothing, a dark disk that drank the iron light and gave none back. Around its rim, points of cold blue moved in slow procession the way lanterns move in a fog. "Ship," Sana said. And there was wonder in it. God help her, there was wonder. 11 years on a rock, and the woman could still be astonished. "Eli, I see it. Nobody comes here." She laughed, just once, helpless. "Nobody ever comes here." The lock cycled. He never knew if she did it or if it did it. The cold came in like a hand, and the lights died all at once. The last thing he saw, before the dark, took. Everything was Sana lifted off the deck, not grabbed, not seized, simply unmoored. The way a leaf goes up off a road when a truck passes, her helmet ringing down the gantry, and her arms going out and her mouth making his name. Then the deck under him fell away too, and he dropped, and the frozen pump shaft swallowed him whole. He hit a slush trap 8 meters down, and the impact broke 2 ribs and saved his life. Above him the station went silent in pieces. He lay in the dark with the cold pressing the broken ends of his bones together, and listened to Coldwater being unwritten, one section at a time. And he did not hum, and he did not scream, and after a long while he began, very slowly, to climb. The Thren Survey Clade, Eshvith that folds, had crossed 900 light-years to catalog a quiet arm of the galaxy. And they were good at their work and bored by it, the 2 conditions that always travel together. They were a people of the warm dark between stars, radial and boneless. A fluted column of muscle and cilia that moved by folding itself shorter and longer. And they spoke to one another in heat, and in a low chord of resonance that ran through the hull of the ship like blood through a body. They had no word that meant alone. They had no word that meant gone and not replaced. When a Thren ceased, the chord shifted to close the gap, the way water closes over a dropped stone, and the clade went on whole, which is to say they could not be wounded in the place where humans keep their wounds. The one who led the catalog was old and well regarded, and called, in the chord, by a resonance that translated poorly, but meant something near first to fold. It had ridden the dark for a span of years that would have crushed a human to powder. And it had grown the particular certainty that comes to those who have seen much, and concluded that there is nothing left to be surprised by. Tertiary of the clade, young, its cilia still pale, brought first to fold the readings from the ice world, and folded itself small in the way that asked to be heard. Bipeds, the tertiary said in heat, the cold world bipeds they make. They build the warm burrow. They tend the machines that split the slush. First, I think they are not animals. I think they speak. To fold, considered the readings with the patience of stone. Around it the cord hummed its endless hymn. The world below was a frozen nothing, the kind of place where life curled small and dim and waited to die, and the structures on it were crude, riveted, leaking heat from 100 bad seals. The Thren had catalogued 10,000 worlds. On a great many of them, animals built, insects built. Tide pulled towers of salt into shapes that looked like cities until you came close. We have crossed too far and burned too much. First-to-Fold told the tertiary, not unkindly, to spend the burn chasing a warm feeling about vermin. It is a cold climate animal. It nests in warmth because the world is cruel. Noted. Tag the specimens. We do not treat you with things that crawl out of ice. Tertiary folded smaller still, which was its way of saying it disagreed and would obey. It did not yet have the standing to do otherwise. Its own readings. Privately, in the way young things keep things, and among them was a recording it could not make sense of, and could not let go. The moment one of the bipeds had been lifted into the hold, and another biped, far below in the structure, had turned and gone toward the danger instead of away. Tertiary ran the recording again and again. In all its short life, it had never once seen a creature break formation to reach a creature already lost. Cord did not do that. The cord closed the gap and moved on. This was something else. Tertiary did not have a word for it. Neither, it would learn, did anyone. There was more in the readings that troubled it, if anyone had cared to look, and only the tertiary did. The bipeds had not been solitary. The survey had taken them expecting to find vermin scattered through the warm burrow, the way vermin scatter, each for itself. But that was not how the structure had been arranged at all. They had nested in pairs and in small bonded clusters, in burrows built for two, with markings on the walls that the clade's instruments read as decoration and the tertiary, alone, suspected were names. When the lift had taken them, the readings showed it again and again, the same impossible thing. A biped reaching after another biped as it rose, hands open, the body straining toward a loss it could do nothing about. The clade had catalogued this as panic. Tertiary watched it 40 times in the dark of its own fold and thought, that is not the shape panic makes. Panic flees, this reaches. Whatever these creatures were, they had not been a herd of separate animals stored together by chance. They had been a great many small families, and the survey had pulled each of them apart at exactly the seam that hurt the most. And not one member of the clade, but the tertiary, had even noticed there was a seam. It took Eli 2 days to climb out of the dark, and they were 2 days he would never give a full accounting of, even to himself. He climbed with 2 broken ribs, and a torn glove and a faceplate webbed with cracks, and he climbed because the only other option was to stop, and he had a private and unfashionable belief, learned young and hard, that a man who stops in the cold has agreed with it about something, and Eli Marrow had never once agreed with the cold about anything. He chewed emergency paste through the crack in his faceplate. He slept in seal foam he sprayed over himself in maintenance niches, an hour at a time, and woke each time sure he had heard Sana's helmet ringing down the gantry, and each time it was only the ship overhead, the slow tidal gromphit of Tethys. The ordinary patient murder of the place. He talked to himself on the long pitches, not words exactly, just the 6 notes, over and over, a handrail made of sound. He had learned long ago that the cold takes the big things first, the panic and the despair, because they burn too hot to last, and leaves you only the small stubborn ones, the next handhold, the next breath, the next 6 notes, and that if you are the kind of creature that can live inside the small, stubborn things, the cold cannot finish you. He was that kind of creature. His whole species was. He just hadn't known yet that it was about to matter on a scale larger than a frozen pump. When he reached the surface gantry, there was no station left to speak of. Only the skeleton of it, the warm burrow torn open and frozen, every soul gone, lifted up the way Sana had been lifted, neat as harvest. He went through it room by room because he made himself, because a man who does not look does not get to grieve honestly later. And there was nothing, no bodies, no blood, only the ordinary leavings of 41 interrupted lives. A half-played game of cards frozen to a table, Voss's apron on its hook, A child's drawing in the tannin quarters held to the bulkhead with a magnet, a stick figure family under a yellow sun on a world none of them would ever see again. Eli stood a long time in front of the drawing. Then he stood in his breeched suit with his ribs grinding and his breath turning to frost on the inside of his cracked faceplate, and he understood that he was the only living thing on Tethys 9, and that the ship still hung overhead, patient, gathering. A lesser man, or a wiser one, would have died there. The cold was generous with that exit. Instead, Eli Marrow did the stubborn, stupid, magnificent thing that his species does when you take everything from it. He looked for a way up. He found it in the survey drones. The Thren dropped them by the dozen to scrape samples, blind glittering things the size of a man's head that hovered down, took what they wanted, and rose again into the belly of the disk on a thread of suspension. Eli had spent 11 years learning what rises and what falls and why. He waited in the wreck of the coolant exchange, where the drones came thickest. And when one settled to scrape frost from a ruptured tank, he wrapped himself around it, the way you'd wrap yourself around a cliff in a fall, arms and legs and ruined fingers. And he held on through the lift and the cold and the rising dark, and he did not let go. And he hummed his 6 notes the whole way up so he would not start screaming. Because once he started, he was not sure he could stop. Truth. The drone carried him into a wound of blue light in the underside of the ship. He let go in the dark and dropped and landed badly and lay still, breathing the strange warm air that was not quite air, and waited to be found. He was not found. That was the first thing he learned about them. The Thren did not watch the way humans watch. They felt the cord and trusted it. And the cord did not know him, did not have a place for him. And so to the ship he was a temperature that should not be there, and nothing more. An error they would correct when they had time. He had walked into the one blind spot a creature without loneliness will always have. He was alone, and being alone made him invisible to a people who had never once been. The hold was a cathedral of cold. Eli came to understand where he was, the way you understand a wound, slowly, and then all at once. The Thren had taken the bipeds for what they were. Cold world animals, and they had done the careful, decent thing a good naturalist does with a specimen. They had preserved it in its native environment. They had frozen them. Killed. The readings said cold things, sleep in cold, but slowed, banked like coals, stored upright in lattices of blue ice that ran away into the dark in rows longer than cold water had been long. He walked the rows he had to. He hummed, and he walked the rows in the faint hum of the ship and the faint hiss of the cold. And there was no other sound, no scream and no music, only the silence. And the silence was the worst thing he had ever stood inside of, worse than the dark in the pump shaft. Because the dark had been empty and this was full. Faces he knew, held in the blue. Voss the cook with frost in his beard. The tannin kid who'd been on his first rotation. The whole vanished town of Coldwater, standing in the cold like a congregation that had forgotten how to leave. A drone came through while he stood there, and Eli learned the second thing about them, which was how to disappear. The little glittering thing drifted down the aisle on its thread, scraping a sample of frost here, a sample there, indifferent. And Eli pressed himself between 2 lattices and stood as still as the dead around him and matched their stillness, breathing through his teeth so his breath would not plume. And the drone passed within a hands of his face and did not see him because it was looking for motion. And a man who has worked the deep cold knows how to be a thing that does not move. He stood among the frozen until the drone was gone, and a long while after, and the not screaming was the hardest work he had ever done. There is a particular horror in standing among the bodies of everyone you have ever known, and being the only one with a heartbeat to give you away. He did not let it give him away. He hummed it down to nothing, and he kept walking the rows. He passed through a place where the Thren had hung other things, the fauna of a dozen worlds. Strange carcasses banked in the blue in long swaying ranks, and he had to walk between them. The catalogued dead of the galaxy, turning slightly on their threads in the breath of the cold engine. And the only sound the whole long way was the faint street hum of the ship and the small wet tick of frost forming. And somehow, that silence was more terrible than any roar could have been. A roaring thing you can fight. A silent thing has already decided you don't matter enough to roar at. He came out the far side of it changed. The way you come out of certain rooms changed. And he did not look back at the swaying ranks. And he never spoke of that part of it to anyone for the rest of his life. He found Sana in the 9th row. She stood with her face turned up the way it had been. Turned up at the end, watching weather that wasn't there. And the frost had made a pale crown of her hair. And Eli put his ruined hand against the ice in front of her, and he did not pray because he had nothing to pray to. And he did not weep because the cold takes that from you too. He stood with her until the standing became a decision instead of a grief. Then he started, quietly, savagely, to think. He was a coolant tech. He had spent his whole life learning the one thing these creatures had built their whole ship around. Cold was their tool and their cage. And he was beginning to understand their blind faith. They thought cold was sleep. They thought cold was peace, was stasis, was the gentle off switch of the universe. They had never lived inside it the way his species had, intense on mountains and burrows under ice, fighting it every hour, learning it, hating it, needing it. To the Thren, the cold was a curator's tool. Eli Marrow, the cold, was a language he had been speaking since before he could walk, and these things had just locked him inside a library, written entirely in his mother tongue. 2 of the Thren came to debate her. Eli was up in the latticework by then, folded into the dark between the cold rows, the way he'd folded into 100 crawl spaces in a hard life, and he watched them come. 2 columns of folding muscle, one old and pale-banded, one young, drifting down the aisle on the cord, and though their speech was heat and resonance, the ship rendered something of it into the cold air as pressure and tone, and a man who has listened to machines his whole life can read more than words. The old one stopped before Sana. The young one folded small. Dispute Eli pieced together over the hours was this. The catalog had to be closed. Every specimen had to be filed before the clade folded space again and moved on. And the bipeds did not fit the form. If they were animals, they were cargo, under stock, raw biomass to be cataloged and processed and forgotten. And the old one's certainty wanted them filed exactly there, under a heading that meant roughly livestock of cold worlds, because to file them otherwise was to admit the burn had been spent on something that mattered. And to admit that was to admit a span of years of being wrong. If they spoke, if they made, if they were people, then there was another form entirely, a heavy and ancient one. The contact protocol, the treaty form, and filing a creature there meant you could not render it, could not store it, had to wake it and speak to it, and answer for what you had already done. The young one, the tertiary, wanted that form. It had the recording. It kept showing the old one, the recording, the biped that had turned and gone toward the danger, and asking what animal does this, and the old one kept answering with the patience of stone. That grief was that loyalty was a chemical, that the universe was full of chemicals that looked like souls if you were young and wanted them to be. File them as stock, the old one said, in the heat that Eli felt as a slow warmth and a pressure behind the eyes. Close the catalog. We fold at the next dark tide. I will not spend the clades standing on a warm feeling. And the young one, who could not win and would not yield, did the small Thren thing. It asked for the time the form allowed. The contact protocol could not be denied outright while a dispute was open. It bought a delay, a single dark tide of delay while the matter sat unfiled. Eli did not understand the words. He understood the shape of it the way he understood a seizing pump. They could not decide what he was. And while they could not decide, they could not finish. The whole great cold machine of their certainty had a gap in it, a half-second of silence before the sis. And they had handed it to him with their own bureaucracy. A man who knows machines knows that you do your work in the gap. He had a dark tide. He did not know how long a dark tide was. He decided it was long enough because the alternative was to lie down in the cold with Sana and let it be peace. And Eli Marrow had never once in his life let the cold tell him what it was. He went down into the body of the ship. It was built the way living things are built, which is to say it was built around the carrying of fluids. And Eli had spent 11 years inside the carrying of fluids. The Thren ran their cold through the hull in great arteries of coolant. The same slush-derived fluid cold water had spent its life refining because of course they did, because they were a survey clade, and they took what a world offered and Tethys 9 offered cold. The conduits were vast and dark and warm-walled, and they ran everywhere, lung to limb, And they were exactly, precisely, the one environment in the universe where Eli Marrow was the most dangerous thing alive. He moved through them the way the creature in an old story moves through the storm drains under a sleeping city, unseen, unheard, a thing the architecture was not built to expect. Once, in a wide junction where 4 arteries met, the cord found him. He felt it before he understood it, a pressure in the walls, a change in the warmth, and then a maintenance form came drifting up the conduit toward him. A thread unfolded long and thin to fit the pipe, running a cilia light along the seams, and there was nowhere to go but down. He let go of the conduit wall and dropped into the cold return channel below, into the flow itself, into the slush he had refined his whole life, and he let it carry him, frozen and silent and tumbling in the dark, holding his ruined breath while his broken ribs screamed, and the cold tried to take his hands, and he came up off coughing in a settling tank 3 junctions down, and lay there shaking and did not make a sound. Thren moved on. It had felt a wrongness in the warmth and found nothing, because a man in the cold flow reads to them as cold, reads as thing, reads as home. He had hidden inside the very thing they trusted. He lay in their water and learned the shape of the ship from the inside of its own blood. And when he stopped shaking, he climbed out and went back to work. He learned the ship through its pipes. He found the rendering hall, where the form would send the specimens if the old one won, and he marked it. He found the cord spine, the great resonant column down the center of the ship where the Clade's speech ran like blood, and he understood that it was both their nervous system and their throat, and their faith. And he marked that too. He found the cold engine, the heart that fed the arteries. The thing that made the whole ship a tomb at the temperature these creatures believed was mercy. He worked in the dark, with no light but the blue bleed of the coolant and the iron memory of every system he had ever fixed. And the work steadied him, the way work does, the way it always had. A grieving man can do nothing. A working man can do anything. Eli Marrow had buried that lesson so deep in his hands that even the end of the world could not pry it loose. And he found in the conduits near the hold a place where the cold ran thin, where a bad weld in their otherwise perfect work had let a finger of warmth bleed into a junction. They had built a ship across 900 light years. And they had a leaking seal, because everyone does, because the universe is held together with bad welds and stubbornness. And Eli Marrow had been fixing exactly this kind of seal his whole life. He sat with it a long while in the dark, breathing, his ribs grinding, his frostbitten fingers tracing the failure. He did not fix it. He made it worse very carefully with the patience of a man who has all night and nothing left to lose. Sure. A tertiary of the clade Eshveth that folds was in the hold when the cord began to go wrong, and it was the first to feel the wrongness. Because it had been listening for wrongness. Because it had a recording it could not let go of. The cold was failing in the 9th row. It should not have been possible. The cold engine ran perfect, had run perfect for the span of the survey, and now in one junction the warmth was bleeding upward and the blue ice was sweating. And one specimen, one biped, the very one the old one had filed under stock, and the very one the recording had been about, was no longer in its lattice. Its place stood empty and wet. The tertiary sounded the alarm into the cord, and the cord carried it, and the clade folded toward the hold. And first to fold came down the aisle with the certainty of stone, ready to find a failed seal and a thawed carcass slumped on the deck, ready to be unsurprised one final time. What it found was Sana Okoro standing on her own feet. She was barely standing. The cold had her still in its teeth, and she shook with it. And her lips were gray, but she stood, held up under one arm, by a creature the Thren had not catalogued at all. A second biped, scarred and breathing frost, that had come up out of the conduits where nothing was supposed to fit, and was even now lowering her, with terrible gentleness, behind itself. Biped put itself between the clade and the female, and it made a sound. 6 notes, low, rough, almost nothing. The ship rendered it into the cold air, and the tertiary felt the old one's cords stutter, because the clade had spectrographed every signal the bipeds made, and filed them all as territorial or mating or distress. And this was none of those. This was not aimed at the clade. This was aimed at the shaking female behind him, and it was not a warning and not a threat. It was the sound you make, to a frightened thing, to tell it you are there. It was, the tertiary understood with a lurch that ran the length of its body, a comfort. Shh. The animal was comforting its mate, while standing into the path of a power that had unwritten its entire world. What animal does this? The tertiary said into the cord, and this time it did not ask. It said it like a verdict. What animal does this? First to fold was old and well regarded, and it had concluded long ago that there was nothing left to be surprised by, and that conclusion is the most fragile thing a mind can carry. It looked at the biped, and it reached, as it had reached 10,000 times, for the certainty that grief was a chemical, and loyalty was a chemical, and the warm feeling in the tertiary was the foolishness of the young, and the biped, watching it the whole time, reached up with one ruined hand and closed a valve. The cold went out of the ninth row entirely. It was a small thing. It was, to the Thren, an incomprehensible thing, because they did not weaponize cold. They curated it, and it had never once occurred to a single member of the clade, across the whole span of the survey, that the gentle off-switch of the universe could be aimed. Eli Marrow had spent 2 days walking the rows, and in the conduits he had not only worsened one seal. He had spent his single dark tide doing the work a coolant tech does, the slow, patient, murderous work of rerouting a system, and he had turned their arteries inside out. He had taken the cold that fed the whole hold, and he had gathered it, banked it, pent it up behind the bad welds, and the closed valves like floodwater behind a failing dam, and now, with one hand in front of the certainty of stone, he opened the gates. Cold engine, starved of its return flow and screaming through channels that no longer made sense, did the thing that machines do when a man who hates them and loves them and knows them better than they know themselves decides their time has come. It surged. The pent cold came down the arteries all at once, far more and far faster than the curators had ever meant the ship to hold, and it found the cord spine, the great resonant throat of the clade, and it froze it. The hymn stopped. For the first time in the memory of the clade Eshveth that folds, the cord went silent. They were severed, each from each, 100 folding columns, suddenly and utterly alone, in a way no Thren had ever been alone, and they had no word for it, no grammar, no scripture, nothing in 900 light years of preparation for the simple human fact of standing in a cold dark room with no one's voice but your own. It is the oldest thing our species knows. It is the thing we are born, screaming against, and spend our whole lives learning to bear. They had never borne it for an instant. They broke, not in violence. The Thren had no real violence in them, but in the way ice breaks, all at once and silently, their certainty going to pieces in the dark. And first to fold, folded a smaller than a tertiary, smaller than it had ever folded, alone for the first and last time in its long life. And in that aloneness, it finally understood the recording. It understood the biped, that turned, and went toward the danger. You only do that. You only break formation to reach the lost, if you have already lived your whole life inside the silence the cord had just discovered, and learned, against all sense, to go toward other people anyway. That is the thing the form could not file, not animal, not the warm feeling of the young, something that knows it is alone, knows it down to the bone, and reaches for you regardless. The old one had spent a span of years certain there was nothing left to be surprised by, and the last thing it learned was that it had been surprised by the most common creature in the cold. Eli did not know any of that. He was a man in a freezing room with 2 broken ribs and the woman he loved shaking against his back, and all he knew was that the things had gone still and silent and small, and that the cold he had called down was now coming for him too, because the cold does not take sides. The cold never takes sides, it only tells the truth. He got Santa up. He got her arm over his shoulder and he walked her out of the cathedral of cold, the way he'd walked into it, through the pipes, through the dark, humming, always humming. The 6 notes from a kitchen in a place with weather, and she came awake enough and on his back to hear it, and to whisper the words to it, that he had never once known had words. Because his mother had hummed it too and never sung it, and the 2 of them went down through the throat of a stricken ship, with one human song in the dark between them. Charia. The Tertiary found them at the wound in the hull where the drones came and went. It rose up in the aisle in front of them, pale and shaking, severed from its cord, more alone than it had ever been. And Eli set Sana down and put himself in front of her again. and raised his ruined hands. Because he was out of valves and out of cold, and out of everything but the oldest reflex of his kind, which is to stand in the way. The tertiary did not strike. It had no striking in it. It folded, instead, the way it had folded, 100 times to ask to be heard. And it did a thing no Thren had done to a catalogued creature in the long memory of the clade. It opened the hull, it gave them the way out. And as the drone lock cycled and the strange warm knot air began to pull toward the dark, the tertiary pressed something into the cold beside the human, a small slab of the clade's own substance, etched heat, that would hold its shape in the cold of the wreck below. The only thing it had to give, the form. The contact protocol, filled out. The bipeds of the cold worlds, filed at last, in the heavy ancient heading that meant people, that meant cannot be rendered, that meant must be answered for. The young one had won the dispute, the only way it could be won, by letting one of them write the verdict with his own 2 hands. Then it let them go. They found Eli Marrow 11 days later, when a fuel hauler finally answered Coldwater's Deadman beacon and came down through the iron light to a station that wasn't there. They found him in the wreck of the coolant exchange, in a tent of salvage and emergency heat, with Sana Okoro alive beside him and 40 other souls of the dead town, thawing slowly in his careful, patient, expert care, because he had gone back up the drone thread, again and again, into the silent ship, and brought them down one at a time out of the cold, the whole vanished congregation. Because that was the work, because you go back for the lost, because that is the one thing we are, and the one thing they could never file. Most of them lived, some didn't. Eli sat with the ones who didn't, each of them, and hummed. It had cost him more than the rescue ever showed. Going back up the drone thread into the silent ship, the first time had been the hardest thing. Harder than the climb, harder than the cold engine. Because the first time he did it, he did not yet know whether the things would wake and find him, and he went anyway, alone, into the dark that had taken his whole world, and brought down Voss, and then went back for the Tannen kid, and then went back again, 22 more times across the long days, while the ship's silence held, never sure each trip would not be the last, hauling the banked coals of his town, down out of the cold one body at a time on a thread spun for harvesting drones. By the end, his ruined hand would not close at all, and his ribs had set wrong, and he did the last few trips, on stubbornness alone, on the 6 notes, on the simple animal refusal to leave anyone in the cold that the old one had filed, in the end, under the only heading that fit. He did not think of it as brave. He would have been baffled by the word. He thought of it as the work. There were people in the cold, and he knew the cold, and so he went and got them. That was the whole of his reasoning. And it was also the entire case for his species. And he never once noticed that the two were the same thing. The ship was gone by then. It had folded space at the next dark tide, and taken its silenced clade and its surprised old certainty out into the warm dark between stars. And somewhere out there a tertiary, with pale cilia, was carrying a recording it would never delete. And a verdict it had let a human write. And the cord, when it healed, when it closed back over the silence the way water closes over a stone, would carry one new thing in its endless hymn that it had never carried before. Not a warning, not a fact. Caution, past clade to clade across 900 light-years and more, that there is a kind of life that lives inside the cold and the dark and the alone, that does not have the cord to save it and reaches for its own anyway, and that you must not, under any heading, on any form, ever again mistake for an animal. Eli Marrow never knew that part. He didn't need it. He sat in the thawing wreck of his whole small world with Sana's hand in his ruined one, and outside the iron light fell down the way it always had. And there was no weather, there was never any weather, and he turned his face up to the dark the way she always had, watching for it anyway, and after a while, because he was alive and she was alive, and that was the only argument his species had ever needed, he began, very quietly, to hum.